Welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick de Bois. On this week's show, as Britain's general election looms, calls for voting reforms are growing. But what are the chances of this happening, and how might this change democracy in the country? The UK has long used a first-past-the-post electoral system with hundreds of constituencies in which the winner takes all. But there are calls from across the political spectrum to switch to a fairer, more modern system. Smaller parties stand to gain the most from any potential change. But the idea is also backed by members of the main opposition Labour Party. It's clear there is some momentum behind the idea, and according to the polls, the idea does also have public support. However, in 2011, the public overwhelmingly rejected changing the electoral system, with more than two-thirds opting to keep first past the post. Only 32% said yes to the alternative vote arrangement. To see why smaller parties are asking to ditch the current voting arrangement, let's take a look at the 2019 election results, which show how much harder they had to work for every seat gained. The Conservatives got one seat for every 38,300 votes, while for Labour it was every 50,800 votes cast. By contrast, the Liberal Democrats needed 336,000 per seat. The stakes increased for the Green Party at 866,400 votes. It was even worse for the Brexit Party, now called Reform UK. They didn't get a single seat, despite winning 644,000 votes. So, what are the prospects of a revamp to the voting system? Joining us now to discuss this is Alan Duncan, a former British Foreign Minister and former Conservative MP, and Mark Littlewood, Director of Popular Conservatism and former head of the Institute of Economic Affairs. He was also an advisor to Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Sir Alan, let me kick off, if I may, with you. We saw in the recent by-elections, Reform scored 13% share of the vote in Wellingborough, 10% in Kingswood. Now, if that was replicated, a big if, but if that was replicated across the country, that would be they would get about 4 million votes, but almost certainly no representation in Parliament. Isn't that one of the big drawbacks of first-past-the-post electoral system we have in the United Kingdom?
No, we've got a system where you have one person representing one constituency and a process of electing that one person to that constituency. But for someone to form a government, they have to have a broad range of support across a wide range of issues. Reform doesn't. The Lib Dems don't at the moment. They might, in some circumstances, just break through in individual constituencies if they get enough support. But just because across the board they have a certain percentage, you say they should have that same percentage of MPs, I think is not right, because what you do if you have that via proportional representation is you give power to extremes like you have in Israel, you give undue power to extremes, and indeed it becomes a system of unfair votes, not fair votes. So I think the existing system is broadly right. We might discuss in a minute whether we have the right system for picking the one person in each individual constituency. But because we have a parliamentary system where the largest party, or the party that can command a majority in Parliament, is the one that forms the government, only I think this system can bring that around in a fair way. Because if you have proportional representation, you have bargaining afterwards, and often you end up with a government that absolutely nobody voted for.
Well, we will come back to that very point, because that was the case in the coalition government of 2010. But may I turn to you, Mark? It's kind of easy to see why first-past-the-post system favours the two major parties, because it does essentially keep them in power, doesn't it?
Yes, that's about right, Nick. And what you'll tend to find, I'm not suggesting that Sir Alan is being anything other than completely sincere in his views, but there's a remarkable correlation between representatives of political parties that do well out of the first-past-the-post system supporting it and political parties that don't do well out of the first past the system opposing it. So there seems to be a lot of a sort of judgment of whether people have got skin in the game. The first past the post system, as it works in the UK in very broad terms, is sort of fair to you if you're probably getting around 30% of the vote. You'll probably get about that sort of representation in Parliament. Is generous to you if you're getting, say, 40% of the vote or above. You're very likely to form a majority government. So parties that are in that sort of range, or tend to be from one election to the next, benefit from the system.
Sir Alan, you talked about the link between the constituency MP and his constituents is very strong under first past the post. But I put it to you, it's also a system that's presided over what we're seeing now, which is a huge disenfranchisement of people, or rather disengagement of people from politics. It's quite likely we're about potentially going to see a low turnout at the next election because the two major parties seem to have disappointed. Again, wouldn't it be better to try and empower more voters in a constituency by making them appreciate that their vote will count for something under a proportional representation system, rather than count for nothing where it's first past the post if they lose?
Firstly, I don't think it would count for more, and I don't think at the moment it counts for nothing. I mean, the problem we have is fragmentation. I mean, the Conservative Party is falling to bits with no end of factions, of which Mr. Littlewood is a champion of one. And I'm not sure this is doing any good. This is what is disappointing in politics, and this is what is destroying the stability and the cogency of our political credibility. So I think it's essential, if we're to have a competent government, to have parties which come in with a considered platform, who can command a majority, and also who have a pool of talent from which ministers can be driven. Now, that whole system at the moment is completely falling to bits. But Parliament is an organic institution. You do elect 650 odd members at a general election. But in the course of that Parliament, some people split away, some people change, some people get grumpy, you get factions, you get issues, and that's what Parliament is for. But I think if you have a system where all you're looking at is the percentage of a party which gets a vote, where some of those parties are little more than just sort of protest groups. I mean, I don't actually think Reform, for instance, has that wide set of policies over everything that's needed for a political manifesto. And therefore, you would not have a group of people who are equipped for government. Now, you could argue at the moment that neither of the major parties is doing very well.
But isn't that up to the voters to decide, whatever your opinion? And they would have that choice and be able to make that informed choice, whatever the voting system.
Yeah, well, they can vote however they want at the moment. And, you know, a lot of the votes are protest. And unfortunately, more and more people are staying away. But at the end, we're electing a government. And what you need is a government that's going to work. And we do have a system in Parliament which is, if you like, adversarial. You're either for something or you're against it. That's why you have the ayes and the noes, and you have people sitting on one side and the other. But I think that a system which then introduces, 2% here, 3% there, will probably make government unworkable, as we see in a number of countries. And don't forget, we have got some minorities. You've got the Scottish National Party, you've got the Liberal Democrats. We don't yet have a Reform or a UKIP or, a communist MP, but we have had individuals in the past, particularly at by-elections, who have won.
Mark, one of the staunch arguments in defence there from Sir Alan was actually it produces stable government first past the post. I think the last few years have shown us the one thing it doesn't produce is stable government. But is his wider point correct that, broadly speaking, with proportional representation, the voters ultimately get ignored because deals are done in back rooms?
Yeah, I think that is a fair point. And if you, when we cast from the UK our gaze to, say, other European countries and all the results are counted, I look at the recent Dutch elections, for example, one's left scratching your head. You don't really know who's won. I mean, you can see which party's got the highest share of the vote, but that certainly doesn't mean they're going to form the government. It could be a range of other smaller parties that then gang up against them. So an attraction of the British system, I do agree with Sir Alan on this, is it's sort of clean and decisive. You're more or less picking between one of the two big parties to form a government. Doesn't always fall that way, doesn't have to fall that way. We've seen a coalition government in recent years in Britain. We've seen a minority Conservative government supported by the Northern Irish Democratic Unionist Party. more or less, by and large, the party with the largest number of votes can be expected to win a majority in Parliament, and that definitely has some benefits. We've already mentioned the individual constituency link system. I think that's got some benefits. I actually, but I'm sure I'm flogging a dead horse here, would like to revisit the referendum we had, a little over a decade ago, which was whether to bring in the alternative vote system. This would basically preserve the current electoral system as it is, but instead of casting just one vote with a cross, you'd be able to order the candidates in your constituency by priority. So you might, for example, have Reform UK as your first choice, but Conservatives as your second choice. If you cast your ballot in that way and the Reform UK candidate got nowhere or nearly nowhere or only 10% of the vote, you're instructing the returning officer, if my main man doesn't make it, transfer it to the next person. That still would retain the ability to produce a decisive result in the election and a clear government, one that's not stitched together in smoke-filled rooms by parties that have only got 2% of the vote each. And I think has a lot to commend it.
Go ahead, Alan, do.
Yeah, chip in. I mean, I think we may be finding a broad measure of common ground here. Just before you brought up alternative vote, which I'll come straight back to, I mean, I just point out that, over time, it may not just be the two big parties who are fighting each other. We might find, for instance, after this election, there isn't much of a Conservative Party left, and that the whole party balance between parties is historically changed. But on the alternative vote, it addresses the argument which I think we haven't yet heard against the first past the post system, which is someone can get in with 32% of the vote. And surely in a majority system, they ought at least to have 50%. The thing about the alternative vote system, where instead of casting one, you're putting one cross on the ballot paper, you, as Mark says, do 1, 2, 3, is that someone only gets elected once they've accumulated just over or 50% or more of the vote. Now, I invariably had more than 50%, so I would have been all right on the first ballot. But I think in a lot of constituencies, it's sort of a three-way split. And therefore, you may find that the person who wins has a vast majority of people against them who they would not and who would not want to have seen them elected. So if you do have a sort of 1, 2, 3 system, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it might be, so that you drop out until the remaining person has secured over 50%, then no one can say that in a single member constituency, the person has not been elected by a majority of the voters. So I was surprised that the AV referendum in 2012, whenever it was, didn't get much sort of political coverage. It didn't excite people, and people rejected it.
Well, it may be that it's just actually quite complicated. London voters will no longer now face a very complicated voting system for a mayor of London because they've returned to first past the post with the upcoming elections. But before I move on from that point, if I may, before we get too technical, Mark, there's another interesting point to make here. You were and are an ardent Brexiteer. It's conceivable that after the referendum in 2016, which led to a period of destabilisation for sure, Theresa May went on to win a minority government election with about 42% of the vote. Under proportional representation, history could have been different. Under the proportional representation system that you see some merits in, the bottom line is there could have been a majority in Parliament for stopping or at least having a light Brexit. Does that change your view on perhaps the merits of proportional representation?
Well, no, because as I said right at the start of this segment, Nick, I don't think I should design an electoral system that is most likely to deliver for me what I want. I think I should support an electoral system and a constitutional process that is objectively fair. And here's the other thing worth bearing in mind. Sir Alan rightly says that first past the post doesn't always and permanently put in aspect a two-party system that changes are possible. The collapse of the Liberal Party 100 years ago and its replacement by the Labour Party, for example. But we shouldn't assume that were we to move to a proportional system, that people's voting habits would remain the same. It will have an impact on how people vote. So to give you an example, if there are a lot of what happens in first past the post at the moment is you get an awful lot of tactical voting. You'll find in seats, and I think you would have seen this in the two by-elections that we held in Thursday that candidates will position themselves to say, well, I might not be your first choice, but I'm the only realistic prospect here of defeating, say, the Conservative Party. So vote for me, even if your first preference is for the Liberal Democrats, for Reform, for the Independent or for Green or whatever. Well, if you had a proportional system or a different electoral system, voting behaviour would differ enormously. I actually think the Liberal Democrat Party would have more of a problem. Often their pitch in certain seats is a sort of none of the above, but in certain seats, we've got the best chance of beating the Conservatives. But if the electoral system changes in some way, well, that becomes less of a clarion call. And I'd also like to see an electoral system, ideally, if we could find one, which discourages tactical voting. I want people to vote for their honest preferences, not to have to second guess, is it a wasted vote if I vote Conservative here, or is it a wasted vote if I vote
Alan, that
Labour
is
there?
a legitimate point, isn't it? We saw in those by-elections huge tactical voting by the Liberal Democrats, and really they should be, isn't it better people vote and can vote with influence with their vote for who they want?
Yeah, but by-elections always exaggerate these tactical voting habits. But I think Marx has sort of seized on a very important point here, which is that of changing behaviour. And if you had PR, it is fragmenting in the sense that people might be inclined to vote for single-issue parties because they thought that if that single-issue party, let's say the anti-abortion party or the pro-something or the anti-something else party, were to hold the balance of power, it can get its way on the issue it feels most strongly about. So that means it gives disproportionate significance to individual issues which otherwise have to be part of a broader set of policies satisfying a broader set of people. So that behavioral change from PR can be very difficult. You only need to look at Israel for that, where Orthodox Jewish people have an extraordinary hold over the Israeli government, because without them Netanyahu would not be able to govern, because it's a system of PR, which in my view is not really properly democratic. It is disproportionately democratic and gives unfair power to minorities.
What about collaboration in government? Now, in 2010, a surprise result with David Cameron ending up in coalition with the Liberal Democrats for 5 years. Alan, you were part of that government. I think it's fair to say that was one of the more stable periods of government. Collaboration works, doesn't it? And wouldn't people therefore not, as you say, they shouldn't be frightened of PR? It might actually bring better government.
Well, I think it was a very unusual political outcome. But of course, it was cooperation between major parties rather than a post-government coalition, which no one could possibly have foreseen. But yeah, it was quite good. And for instance, it set up the National Security Council, within which there was a lot of cooperation between the Liberal Democrats and Conservatives, who were sitting around a much more effective quasi-cabinet table than if they were sitting, or than when they were sitting around the cabinet table itself. So it did work quite well. And it meant that, either side had to look over their shoulder at what the reaction of their coalition partners would be before they started sort of sounding off particularly strongly. So it reduced, because in this coalition sort of formula, if you like, the adversarial Yahoo side of politics. And there are many aspects of it which were very healthy and very effective. It made everyone have to sit down and be reasonable. And indeed, what was interesting in this, it sort of froze out some of the more extreme voices in either party because they had to get on with each other.
But Mark, just picking up a little bit on that point, the trade-off there that Sir Alan referred to earlier was within days of the general election, the manifestos were being selectively ditched. So if you like, the respect that politicians are meant to pay to manifestos was ditched even quicker than usual. That's not good for democracy or politics, is it?
Well, I don't really know what one's supposed to do in the scenario in which you run on a manifesto. It then turns out that you haven't won the election outright, so you're not able to implement it. But it also turns out that because of the way that the cards have fallen, because of the way the numbers have fallen, you have some influence over the government.
But just to pick up your point, if I may, apologies for interrupting. In a system where you are almost guaranteed to end up with collaboration As a voter, you might as well just ignore the manifesto because it's an absolute certainty it's going to be compromised on. That can't be healthy.
Well, I'm not really concerned about manifestos being compromised. I mean, they're not legally binding documents. They're a public platform by a political party that paints an intention of how it will lead the government were it to prevail. It can't anticipate every future circumstance that might alter that. I mean, to give you an example, no political party at the last election put forward a coherent plan about what they would do if a worldwide pandemic hit, probably the most important public policy the government had to come up with. So you can't always expect the manifesto to be an absolutely solemn pledge that this is what you will do and nothing else. It's an indication of the direction of travel. I sometimes wonder whether they're a particularly helpful part of democracy, really.
No, they're not. Sorry to butt in. I say I hear the word mandate and I hear the word manifesto, and I think, oh my God, this is going to go terribly wrong. And it's not really a proper part of politics, because never put a number in a manifesto. I think Theresa May learnt that very strongly, and it's better just to put it on one page about what your basic principles are, the general direction in which you want to head, and what you believe in.
But that's a license to con the public, Alan.
No, it isn't. I mean, I think the manifesto is more like.
I want to know what you're going to do about tax.
And somehow they find a way of getting around them when circumstances change. I mean, detailed manifestos are not worth the bit of paper they're written on.
Yes, I would agree with that. I would agree with that, Sir Alan. And Nick, to your point, I can understand your wish or the wish of the electorate to sort of know as they go into a general election exactly what the tax rate will be 3 years hence. But it's nearly impossible for a political party or a politician to preempt that. The economic circumstances are inherently unpredictable.
But hang on, you politicians and think tanks, and I'll start with you, Alan, if I may, you're always talking about, or were always talking about, holding the public sector to account, giving them targets to do this, to do that. But for yourselves, for the political elite, your trade-off is, actually, we're just going to give you broad brushstrokes so you can't hold us to account. I think I'd feel shortchanged as a voter, wouldn't you?
I don't think so, because I don't think that manifesto commitments can be sort of, drawn within mathematical parameters. It's just not the way ever-changing circumstances and government, work. So I think general principles lead, and implementing them as best you can leads to a much better basis of trust.
Let's
than
talk.
Trying to say, I do 2%, 3%, blah blah.
We've got a couple of minutes to talk about one other aspect. So let me start with you again, if I may, Alan, and we'll come straight to you on the same point, Mark. Is our system in politics questionable? Should it be reformed? Or is it actually the people we are sending to Parliament that are going through a process that is not producing, and I think this is a fair comment, the best we could expect from politicians? Alan.
Yeah, you answered in your question the point I was going to make in answering the first bit of the question. What is the problem of our politics? In the end, it's the people, not the system, although I think the Lords has a problem and needs a lot of reshaping. But the system about Parliament, and where the likes of Mark are really trying to, if you like, fizz up the Conservative Party somehow, are because people have forgotten how to behave. There's no discipline, far too many factions, and people don't vote for turmoil. So this is all about conduct, and also 24-hour news, trying to sound clever and purposeful by spending money through another headline, another press release. This is no way to conduct government. So I think the caliber of politicians has diminished drastically, and the hierarchy of experience within it has been completely turned on its head, where people have been in Parliament for 2 minutes, the next thing you know, they're the Right Honourable this or that and sitting in the cabinet, and it doesn't work. So I think that the speedy promotion, no experience, the calibre of candidates and MPs has completely collapsed.
Mark, the selection process at fault, or is it deeper than that?
No, I agree with quite a lot of what Sir Alan's said there. I do think that although there are many, many very good MPs, the general calibre of MPs has fallen. I don't agree with him so much about parties having different groupings within them that have a different analysis or proposition. I think if you're going to have broadly a two-party system, That's quite healthy for democracy and discussion. The large parties need to be a broad church, not the tiny factional 2% parties that Alan was positing might exist under PR. I think where people get sick and tired and irritated to the back teeth is when parties of any colour just engage in a circular firing squad about who's going to be promoted or is the leader going to go and all of the rest of it. And it becomes about Westminster Games, not about policy.
For time reasons only, Sir Alan Duncan, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Mark Littlewood, thoroughly enjoyed the discussion today here on TRT World. Not only thanks to my guests, thanks to you for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. Just type in Westminster Watch. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.